The snow came early to northern Arizona in the winter of 1882, transforming the high desert landscape into something unrecognizable and deadly. And Zelda Arden knew with absolute certainty that she would die alone on this frozen trail if she did not find shelter within the next hour. Her horse had thrown a shoe 2 days prior, forcing her to lead the limping animal through drifts that reached her knees in places. The wagon train she had been traveling with had moved on without her when she fell behind, their schedule too rigid to accommodate delays. The leader had offered her a rifle and 3 days of rations, telling her the town of Winslow lay another 15 miles north. That had been 4 days ago. She had rationed poorly, eaten the last of her dried beef yesterday morning, and now the cold had settled so deep into her bones that she could no longer feel her feet inside her boots. The landscape offered little protection. Juniper trees dotted the rolling terrain, their branches heavy with snow, but they were too sparse to provide real shelter. The wind cut through her wool coat as though it were made of cotton, and her breath came in shallow gasps that turned to ice crystals in the air before her face. She had stopped sweating hours ago, which she knew was a bad sign. Her body was shutting down, conserving what little warmth remained. When she crested the next rise, she saw smoke. At first, she thought it was a mirage, some cruel trick of her freezing mind. But as she stumbled forward, dragging her reluctant horse behind her, the thin gray column remained steady against the white sky. Someone had a fire. Someone was alive out here in this frozen wasteland. Hope gave her enough strength to continue for another quarter mile before her legs simply stopped working. She fell forward into the snow, and the world tilted sideways. The rope lead slipped from her numb fingers. She tried to call out, but her voice came as barely a whisper. The cold was everything now, filling her lungs, stopping her heart. She closed her eyes. She woke to warmth and the smell of wood smoke and coffee. For a moment, she thought she had died and gone to some pleasant afterlife, but then pain flooded through her extremities as circulation returned, and she gasped aloud. "Easy now. Do not try to move yet." The voice was deep and calm, with a slight roughness that suggested a man who spent more time talking to horses than people. Zelda forced her eyes open and found herself lying on a bedroll near a stone fireplace. The room was small but well built, with thick log walls and a solid roof. Furs and blankets covered her, their weight both comforting and suffocating. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as a croak. "My cabin, about 8 miles south of Winslow." The man moved into her field of vision, and she saw he was younger than his voice suggested, perhaps 26 or 27. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that was more practical than fashionable. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, the color of storm clouds, and they studied her with careful concern. "I found you collapsed about 200 yards from here. You were nearly frozen solid." "My horse." "In the lean-to out back. I pulled the bad shoe and wrapped the hoof. He will be fine with rest." He knelt beside her, and she noticed he moved with the careful efficiency of someone used to being alone. "I am more concerned about you. Can you feel your fingers and toes?" She concentrated, and the tingling pain that answered was almost welcome. "Yes, it hurts." "Good. That means no permanent damage, most likely." He stood and moved to the fireplace where a coffee pot sat on a metal grate over the coals. "What is your name?" "Zelda Arden." "I was traveling to Winslow to meet my uncle. He has a dry goods store there." It was only partially a lie. She did have an uncle in Winslow, though she had not seen him since childhood, and she had no idea if he would even remember her. The truth was that she was running from a failed engagement in St. Louis, and the scandal that had followed when she had caught her fiancé with her cousin 3 days before the wedding. "I am Duncan Pierce." He poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her. "Can you sit up?" With his help, she managed to prop herself against the wall. Her hands shook as she took the cup, and he steadied it with his own until she could drink. The coffee was strong and bitter and absolutely perfect. "How long was I out there?" she asked. "I found you about 3 hours ago. It is almost sunset now." He settled onto a wooden chair near the fire, giving her space but staying close enough to help if needed. "You were unconscious when I found you. I was checking my traps and saw your tracks. Lucky I went out when I did. Another hour and you would have been past saving." The casual way he said it made the truth hit harder. She had come within an hour of dying alone in the snow, and this stranger had saved her life. "Thank you. I do not know how I can repay you." "No repayment needed. Out here you help people. That is just how it works." He studied her for a long moment. "What were you doing traveling alone in winter?" "I was with a wagon train, but I fell behind when my horse went lame. They could not wait." She took another sip of coffee, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "I thought I could make it to Winslow on my own." "In this weather, that was foolish. I know that now." She met his eyes, expecting judgment, but found only honest assessment. "I made a mistake. Several, actually." "Well, you are alive, which means you get the chance to make better choices going forward." He stood and moved to a small table where various supplies were laid out. "Are you hungry?" Her stomach answered before she could, growling loudly enough that he chuckled. It was a warm sound, genuine and surprising. "I will take that as a yes." He began preparing something at the table, his movements practiced and sure. "I do not have much in the way of fancy food, but I can make a decent stew." As he worked, Zelda took the opportunity to study both him and his home. The cabin was clearly the residence of a man who valued function over form. Everything had its place, from the rifles mounted on the wall to the neat stack of firewood beside the hearth. Furs hung from the rafters, curing in the dry heat. The furniture was handmade but solid. This was not a temporary camp but a real home built to last. "You live out here alone?" she asked. "Mostly. I trap during winter, run cattle in the warmer months. I come into Winslow every few weeks for supplies and to sell pelts." He glanced back at her. "It is a quiet life, but it suits me." "You do not get lonely?" "Sometimes, but I prefer my own company to most people's." He added water to a pot and hung it over the fire. "I spent 5 years working cattle drives before I saved enough to buy land and build this place. After that much time surrounded by loud, dirty cowboys, solitude feels like a gift." She smiled despite herself. "I can imagine." As the stew began to bubble, filling the cabin with rich smells, Duncan returned to his chair. "So what is the real reason you are traveling to Winslow in the middle of winter?" "I told you. My uncle has a dry goods store, yes. But that does not explain why you left civilization in December to cross high desert country in what is clearly the worst winter this area has seen in years." His tone was not accusatory, merely curious. "You do not have to tell me if you do not want to, but I have found that the truth usually sits easier than lies, especially when you are stuck in a small cabin with someone." Zelda considered her options. She could maintain the fiction about her uncle, but Duncan was right about the cabin being small. They would be in close quarters for however long it took for her to recover enough to travel, and something about his directness made her want to be honest. "I was engaged to be married," she said finally. "I found him with another woman. I called off the wedding, and the scandal made it impossible for me to stay in St. Louis. My uncle in Winslow was the only family I could think of who might take me in, at least until I can figure out what to do next." Duncan nodded slowly. "That takes courage, walking away like that, or stupidity. Most people think I should have married him anyway. A woman my age cannot afford to be too particular, or so I was told repeatedly." She heard the bitterness in her own voice and tried to soften it. I am 23, practically a spinster by society's standards. Society can go to hell, Duncan said bluntly. Anyone who would marry someone they do not love and trust just to avoid being alone is a coward. You did the right thing. The simple validation hit her harder than she expected. She had spent the entire journey west second guessing her decision, wondering if she had thrown away her only chance at security and respectability. To hear this stranger say she had been right felt like absolution. Thank you for saying that. I am just saying what is true. He stood to check the stew, stirring it with a wooden spoon. You should rest. Your body has been through a serious ordeal. It will take more than a few hours by the fire to fully recover. How long do you think before I can travel on to Winslow? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he turned back to face her, his expression was serious. Honestly, I do not think you should try to travel until spring. Spring? But that is months away. The winter made you too weak to travel on already, and it is only going to get worse before it gets better. We are at high elevation here, and the snow will keep coming through February, maybe into March. Even if you recovered fully in the next week, which you would not, the trail to Winslow will be impassable half the time. He met her eyes steadily. If you try to make that journey in your current condition, you will die. Not maybe. You will die. The certainty in his voice sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. But I cannot stay here for months. I have no money to pay you, no way to contribute. I would just be a burden. Then stay here and grow strong with me. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Zelda stared at him, trying to understand what he was offering. I am not asking for anything improper, Duncan continued, his voice steady. I have 2 rooms. You would have your own space. But this cabin is warm and dry, and I have enough supplies to last through winter for 2 people if we are careful. By spring, you will be strong enough to make the journey safely. And who knows, maybe by then you will have a better idea of what you want to do with your life. Why would you do this for a stranger? Because I found you dying in the snow, and that means something. Out here, we take care of each other. That is the code. He ladled stew into a bowl and brought it to her. Besides, I would not mind the company. As long as you do not mind learning to do things around here. I'm not looking for a guest. I am offering a partnership. You help me with the work, and I will make sure you survive the winter. Fair trade. Zelda took the bowl, her mind racing. Everything in her upbringing told her this was wildly inappropriate, that a single woman could not possibly live in a cabin alone with a bachelor for months on end. Her reputation would be destroyed forever. But then, her reputation was already in tatters. And the alternative was trying to reach Winslow in a blizzard and likely freezing to death before she made it halfway there. What kind of work? She asked. Cooking, mostly. Mending. I am terrible at both. In return, I will teach you to trap, to shoot properly, to survive out here. Useful skills, regardless of where you end up. He gestured around the cabin. It is not a fancy life, but it is honest work, and you would be safe. She studied his face, looking for any hint of ulterior motive, but found only honest sincerity. Duncan Pierce was offering her exactly what he said. A chance to survive the winter and grow strong enough to face whatever came next. All right, she said finally. I accept your offer. He nodded once, as if they had just sealed a business deal, which in a way they had. Good. Now eat your stew before it gets cold. You need to rebuild your strength. The stew was simple but delicious, rich with venison and root vegetables. Zelda ate slowly, feeling life returning to her body with each bite. Across the fire, Duncan ate his own meal in comfortable silence. There was no awkwardness in the quiet, no pressure to fill the space with meaningless chatter. It was oddly peaceful. After dinner, Duncan showed her to the second room, which was smaller than the main living space but comfortable, with a real bed and more furs for warmth. He brought her saddlebags in from where he had stored them and left her to settle in. Alone for the first time since waking, Zelda sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. Just this morning, she had been certain she would die. Now she was warm and fed and safe, committed to spending the winter with a man she had known for less than 6 hours. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something she had not experienced in months: hope. Over the next few days, Zelda focused on recovering her strength. Duncan proved to be a surprisingly attentive caretaker, making sure she ate regularly and did not push herself too hard. He was also a man of his word about propriety, always knocking before entering her room and maintaining a respectful distance. On the fourth day, she felt strong enough to insist on helping with the cooking. Duncan accepted her offer with evident relief. "I can cook enough to keep from starving," he admitted, "but I would not call it enjoyable. If you can make food taste like something other than boiled leather, I would count that as a significant improvement." She laughed and set to work organizing his chaotic pantry. He had the basics: flour, salt, dried beans, coffee along with fresh meat from his hunting and some preserved vegetables. With a little creativity, she could definitely improve on his usual fare. That night, she made biscuits and a proper venison roast with gravy. Duncan ate 3 helpings and looked at her with something close to awe. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked. "My mother." She believed every woman should be able to feed her family well, regardless of whether she had servants to do it for her. Zelda smiled at the memory. She used to say that cooking was the most fundamental way to show love. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. She died when I was 17. The old grief was distant now but still present. "My father remarried quickly. My stepmother and I never got along." "Is she the one who told you to marry the bastard who betrayed you?" She was among the chorus, yes. Zelda cleared the dishes, grateful for something to do with her hands. "She said I was too particular, too proud, that I should be grateful any man of good standing would have me. That is horseshit." The crude word should have shocked her, but instead she found herself laughing. "Yes, it is." As the days turned into weeks, they fell into an easy routine. Zelda managed the cabin, cooking, cleaning, mending his clothes and the furs he trapped. Duncan handled the outside work, checking his trap lines, hunting, chopping wood, and tending to the horses. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and he would teach her things he thought she should know. He started with shooting, taking her outside on a clear day with a rifle and setting up targets against a snowbank. "The most important thing is to respect the weapon," he said, showing her how to hold it properly. "A gun is a tool, but it is a dangerous one. Never point it at anything you do not intend to kill." She learned to steady her breathing, to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it, to account for wind and distance. Her first few shots went wide, but Duncan was patient, adjusting her stance and offering quiet encouragement. When she finally hit the target, the satisfaction was immense. "Good," he said, and the simple praise made her glow with pride. He taught her to read animal tracks in the snow, to distinguish between deer and elk, predator and prey. He showed her which plants were safe to eat and which would kill her, how to find water even when everything was frozen, how to build a fire in the wind. "Why are you teaching me all this?" she asked one evening as they worked together to scrape and cure a beaver pelt. "Because knowledge is survival out here. If something happened to me, I want to know you could make it on your own until you reached safety." He did not look up from his work, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Besides, you are a quick learner. It would be a waste not to teach you." As January gave way to February, Zelda realized she was happier than she had been in years. The work was hard and the conditions were often harsh, but there was a simplicity to this life that appealed to her. Every day had purpose. Every task mattered. And Duncan was unlike any man she had ever known. He was quiet but not cold, observant without being judgmental. He treated her as an equal partner, valuing her contributions to their shared survival. When she had an opinion, he listened. When she made a mistake, he corrected her without condescension. And gradually, she began to notice other things about him, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the rough gentleness of his hands, the sound of his laughter when she said something that caught him off guard. She was falling for him, she realized one night as she lay in her bed listening to him move around in the main room. The knowledge should have frightened her, but it did not. Duncan Pierce was a good man, perhaps the best she had ever known. If she was going to fall in love, she could do far worse. The question was whether he felt anything for her beyond friendly partnership. Duncan knew he was in trouble the day Zelda shot her first rabbit. She had been practicing with the rifle for weeks, and he had finally agreed to let her come along on a hunting trip. They had been moving quietly through the snow-covered forest when she spotted the rabbit and dropped to one knee, her movements smooth and controlled just as he had taught her. The shot was clean, and the rabbit died instantly. When she turned to him with pure joy blazing in her face, something in his chest tightened painfully. He had been attracted to her from the start. He could admit that privately. She was beautiful in an understated way, with dark hair that caught red highlights in the firelight and eyes the color of warm honey. But beauty faded, and he had known plenty of pretty women in his life. What drew him to Zelda was her strength, her resilience, the way she had adapted to this harsh life without complaint. She had arrived at his cabin half frozen and desperate, but she had not stayed that way. She had learned, grown, become capable and confident. She made his cabin feel like a home instead of just a shelter. She made him laugh. She challenged him when she thought he was wrong and admitted when she made mistakes. She was real in a way that most people he met were not, and he was absolutely, completely falling in love with her. Which was a problem, because in a few months, the snow would melt, and she would leave for Winslow to start whatever new life awaited her there. He had no right to ask her to stay, no reason to think she would want the isolated existence he had built for himself. She deserved more than a trapper's cabin and a man who was more comfortable with silence than society. So he kept his feelings to himself and tried to enjoy the time they had left. But it got harder every day. One night in mid-February, a particularly vicious storm hit. The wind howled like a living thing, and snow came down so thick that Duncan could not see the lean-to from the cabin door. He secured everything as best he could and settled in to wait it out. Zelda was unusually quiet during dinner, staring into the fire with a distant expression. When he asked if something was wrong, she shook her head, just thinking. About what? About how different my life is now compared to what it was supposed to be. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. I was supposed to be married by now, living in a fine house in St. Louis, hosting parties and making social calls. Instead, I am in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, wearing buckskin and learning to trap animals. Do you regret it? No, that is what surprises me. She looked at him then, and the firelight made her eyes seem to glow. I thought I would hate this, the isolation, the hard work, the lack of civilization, but I do not. I feel more myself here than I ever did in society. What does that mean, feeling like yourself? She considered the question. It means I do not have to pretend. I do not have to be softer or quieter or more agreeable than I really am. I can just exist exactly as I am, and that is enough. She smiled slightly. You have no idea what a gift that is. Duncan understood more than she knew. It was exactly how he felt about his life out here, away from the expectations and judgments of civilized society. "I am glad you feel that way," he said quietly. The storm raged for 2 full days. On the second night, the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows. Duncan built the fire as high as he dared, but cold still seeped through the walls. Around midnight, Zelda appeared in the doorway of her room, wrapped in every blanket she owned and still shivering. "I am sorry," she said through chattering teeth. "It is too cold. I cannot sleep." Duncan did not hesitate. "Bring your blankets. We will share the warmth." He arranged their bedrolls near the fire, layering furs and blankets to create a warm nest. They lay down side by side, careful not to touch, but even with the space between them, the shared body heat made a difference. "Better?" he asked. "Yes, thank you." They lay in silence for a while, listening to the wind scream outside. Despite the cold and the storm, Duncan felt deeply content. This moment, lying beside Zelda in the firelight, felt right in a way that nothing else in his life ever had. "Duncan." Her voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes." "What will you do when I leave for Winslow?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "I suppose I will go back to my regular life. Trap in winter, run cattle in summer, same as always." "Will you miss me?" The honest answer would reveal too much, but he could not bring himself to lie to her. "Yes, I will miss you very much." She was quiet for so long that he thought she had fallen asleep. Then she spoke again, her words barely audible over the fire's crackle. "I will miss you too." When Duncan woke the next morning, he found Zelda curled against his side, her head on his shoulder and one arm draped across his chest. She must have moved closer in her sleep, seeking warmth. He knew he should wake her, re-establish the proper distance, but he could not bring himself to move. Instead, he lay still and watched her sleep, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the dark fan of her eyelashes, the small scar above her left eyebrow that she had gotten falling from a tree as a child. She had told him that story one evening, laughing at her younger self's recklessness. She stirred and opened her eyes, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then awareness came and she realized how close they were. "I am sorry," she said, starting to pull away. "Do not be." His arm tightened around her before he could think better of it. "You were cold." "I was." But she did not move away, and neither did he. They stayed like that as the fire burned down to embers, neither willing to break the moment. Finally, practical necessity won out. Duncan needed to check on the horses and Zelda needed to start breakfast. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that could no longer be ignored. Over the following weeks, the physical distance they had carefully maintained began to erode. Not in any dramatic way, but in small gestures that spoke of growing intimacy. Duncan's hand on her back as he guided her through a difficult section of trail. Zelda's fingers brushing his as she passed him his coffee. Sitting close together by the fire, their shoulders touching, neither of them spoke about it. Words seemed inadequate and possibly dangerous. If they talked about their feelings, they would have to confront the fact that their time together had an expiration date. In early March, the first signs of spring began to appear. The days grew longer and slightly warmer. The snow started to melt, creating muddy patches around the cabin. Birds returned, filling the morning air with song, and Zelda grew quieter. Duncan knew what she was thinking because he was thinking it too. Soon the trail to Winslow would be passable. Soon she would have to decide what to do next. Soon this strange, perfect interlude would end. He found her one afternoon standing outside the cabin, staring north toward where Winslow lay hidden beyond the hills. The wind played with her hair, and she had her arms wrapped around herself, despite the relative warmth of the day. "Zelda." He approached carefully as though she might spook like a wild animal. "Are you all right? I do not want to go." The words were so quiet he almost missed them. "What?" She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I do not want to go to Winslow. I do not want to leave here. I do not want to leave you." Duncan's heart stopped and then started again, beating so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. "Then stay." "I cannot just stay. What would people think?" "What would? I do not care what people think." He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "Zelda, these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. I wake up looking forward to the day because you are in it. I go to sleep grateful that you are safe and warm under my roof. The idea of you leaving feels like someone is ripping my heart out of my chest. Duncan, I love you." The words came out rough and fierce. "I know I have no right to say it. I know I do not have much to offer you. Just a cabin and a hard life and a man who is probably too comfortable with solitude for his own good. But if you would have me, if you would stay, I swear I would spend every day trying to make you happy." Zelda stared at him, tears now streaming freely down her face. Then she pulled one hand free and pressed it to his cheek. "You foolish man. Do you really not know that I love you too?" The kiss was inevitable, a collision of two people who had been holding back for far too long. Duncan pulled her close and she melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck. She tasted like coffee and honey, and kissing her felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zelda laughed through her tears. "I was so afraid you only saw me as a responsibility, someone you saved who you were stuck with until spring. I saw you as a miracle." He brushed her tears away with his thumbs. "The best thing that ever stumbled into my life, half frozen and stubborn as hell." She laughed again and kissed him once more, softer this time but no less intense. "So you will stay?" he asked when they parted. "Truly, I will stay, on one condition, anything, marry me. I do not care if we have to ride all the way to Winslow to find a preacher, but I am not living in sin with you. My mother would haunt me from beyond the grave." Duncan grinned, joy flooding through him so intensely it was almost painful. "I will marry you, tomorrow if you want. Today, if we can manage it. Tomorrow works." She leaned against him, and he held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "We should probably tell my uncle I will not be needing his hospitality after all. We can ride to Winslow next week, introduce ourselves properly as man and wife." He paused. "If you are sure this is what you want, it is not too late to change your mind." "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." She pulled back to look at him seriously. "I was dead, Duncan, dead in every way that mattered, and you brought me back to life. Not just by saving me from the snow, but by showing me what it means to truly live. How could I possibly walk away from that?" He had no answer except to kiss her again. They rode to Winslow a week later. The journey that had nearly killed Zelda in December took less than a day in the milder March weather. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with wooden buildings and plenty of people moving about their business. Zelda's uncle, Robert Arden, owned a well-stocked dry goods store near the center of town. He was a robust man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that widened in surprise when Zelda introduced herself. "Little Zelda. Good Lord, you were just a child last time I saw you." He pulled her into a hug. "Your letter said you would be arriving in December. I was worried sick when you never showed up." "I ran into some difficulties on the journey," Zelda said diplomatically, "but it all worked out for the best. Uncle Robert, this is my husband, Duncan Pierce." If Robert was shocked by the sudden appearance of a nephew-in-law, he hid it well. He shook Duncan's hand with genuine warmth and insisted they stay for dinner. Over a meal prepared by Robert's housekeeper, Zelda explained a carefully edited version of events. She had been traveling to Winslow when she got caught in a storm. Duncan had saved her life and offered her shelter for the winter. They had fallen in love and married. Robert listened with the attentive expression of a man who suspected there was more to the story, but was wise enough not to pry. "Well, I am glad you found happiness, my dear, even if it was not in the way any of us expected." He smiled at Duncan. "You must be quite a man to have won my niece's heart so quickly." "I am a lucky man," Duncan corrected. "The winning was all on her side." After dinner, Robert took them to meet the local preacher, a jovial man named Reverend Thompson, who agreed to perform a proper marriage ceremony the next morning. He seemed utterly unconcerned about the fact that they had already been living together as man and wife. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said cheerfully. "Who am I to judge how he brings people together?" The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Zelda wore a dress borrowed from Robert's housekeeper, altered hastily to fit. Duncan had bought a new shirt from Robert's store and looked more uncomfortable in it than Zelda had ever seen him. But when he took her hands and spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I, Duncan Pierce, take you, Zelda Arden, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand by your side in all things, for as long as we both shall live." Zelda repeated the words, her own voice thick with emotion. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them man and wife, Duncan kissed her with such tender intensity that the small gathering of witnesses burst into applause. They spent one more night in Winslow, in a room above the general store that Robert insisted on providing. It was their first real privacy since acknowledging their feelings, and they made the most of it, learning each other with gentle reverence. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Zelda traced patterns on Duncan's chest. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "Not a single one. You?" "Only that I did not tell you I loved you sooner. We wasted time being careful when we could have been happy." "We were happy," Zelda corrected. "But this is better." They returned to the cabin 2 days later, riding side by side through country that was rapidly shedding its winter coat. Green shoots pushed through the melting snow. Streams ran high with runoff. The whole world felt new and alive. The cabin looked different to Zelda now, though nothing had physically changed. Before, it had been Duncan's home that she was borrowing. Now it was theirs, a place they would build a life together. Spring gave way to summer, and they fell into new rhythms. Duncan taught Zelda to ride the boundary of his property, to identify the markers he had set. She learned to handle the small herd of cattle he kept, to rope and brand and doctor sick animals. He was impressed by her fearlessness and the quick way she learned. In turn, she transformed the cabin in small ways. She planted a garden near the house, coaxing vegetables and herbs from the rocky soil. She made curtains for the windows and a proper tablecloth. She filled the space with warmth and life in ways that had nothing to do with the fire. They worked hard during the long summer days and fell into bed exhausted each night, wrapped in each other's arms. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pasts, dreams for the future, observations about the world around them. In July, they made another trip to Winslow for supplies. Robert was delighted to see them and insisted on hearing all about their life at the cabin. "You look happy," he told Zelda privately while Duncan was selecting rope at the hardware store. "Truly happy." "I have not seen that in many young women." "I am happier than I ever thought possible," Zelda admitted. "I know it must seem strange to you, this life I have chosen. No society, no culture, just hard work and isolation. What seems strange to me is that people think happiness can only be found in ballrooms and tea parties," Robert said firmly. "You have found a good man who loves you, work that matters, and a life you can be proud of. That is more than most people ever get." His words stayed with Zelda as they rode home. She thought about her old life in St. Louis, the endless round of social obligations and meaningless conversations. She thought about the woman she had been, desperate for approval, willing to marry a man she did not truly love just to avoid being alone. That woman seemed like a stranger now. By August, Zelda suspected she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Duncan, nervous about how he would react. They had not discussed children, and she worried he might feel trapped or overwhelmed. She told him one evening as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Duncan, I have something to tell you." He looked at her, his expression immediately concerned. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong, at least I do not think so." She took a deep breath. "I am fairly certain I am with child." For a long moment he just stared at her. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming it with pure joy. "Truly, truly. I am about 2 months along, I think." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he pulled back, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "That is the best news you could have given me. I was hoping, but I did not want to pressure you. You wanted children. I wanted everything with you. A life, a family, a future." He placed a hand gently on her still flat stomach. "This is more than I ever dreamed of." They spent the rest of the evening making plans. They would need to build a cradle, stock up on supplies before winter, make sure they had everything necessary for a birth this far from a doctor. Duncan was determined to do everything possible to keep Zelda and the baby safe. As autumn approached, Duncan became almost obsessively protective. He would not let Zelda do any heavy lifting and insisted she rest more. She found it both touching and occasionally frustrating. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him after he refused to let her help stack firewood. "I know that, but humor me. You are the most precious thing in my life, and I cannot stand the thought of anything happening to you." How could she argue with that? As her belly swelled, they spent long evenings by the fire talking about the baby. What they would name it, what they hoped for, how their life would change. Duncan built a beautiful cradle from pine wood, carving it with careful attention to detail. Zelda sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart swelling with love for this child she had not yet met. In November, exactly a year after she had nearly died in the snow, Zelda went into labor. Duncan had spent months preparing for this moment, but when it actually happened, he felt utterly helpless. He boiled water, gathered clean cloths, made sure Zelda was as comfortable as possible. But watching her in pain, unable to do anything to help, was agony. "I am fine," she told him between contractions, her face pale but determined. "This is natural. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." That does not make it any easier to watch. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning. Duncan stayed by Zelda's side, holding her hand, offering water, murmuring encouragement. When the baby finally came, a healthy boy with a strong set of lungs, Duncan wept openly. "He is perfect," Zelda whispered, exhausted but radiant as she held their son. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Daniel Robert Pierce, after both grandfathers. He had Duncan's dark hair and Zelda's eyes, and from the moment he entered the world, he made his presence known with loud demands for attention. Parenthood was harder than either of them had imagined, but also more rewarding. Daniel was a colicky baby who slept poorly and cried often. Duncan and Zelda took turns walking him through the cabin at all hours, exhausted but devoted. "I had no idea something so small could be so loud," Duncan said one night as he paced with the screaming infant. Zelda laughed from where she lay collapsed on their bed. My mother used to say that babies cry to prepare their parents for the teenage years. Despite the challenges, they were happy. Watching Duncan with their son filled Zelda with a love so intense it sometimes frightened her. He was endlessly patient, singing to Daniel in a surprisingly good baritone, telling him stories about the mountains and the animals that lived there. As Daniel grew from infant to toddler, the cabin became a livelier place. He was into everything, exploring with fearless curiosity that gave his parents constant heart attacks. He would chase chickens, try to pet the horses, climb anything he could reach. Duncan built a small fence around the garden to keep him out of mischief, but Daniel treated it as a challenge to overcome. "He gets that from you," Duncan told Zelda as they watched their 3-year-old son attempt to scale the fence for the 4th time that day. "Me. I am the sensible one in this relationship. You were the one who thought you could walk to Winslow in a blizzard. That was different. I was desperate, and I am desperately in love with you." He pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Even when our son is clearly insane." Life fell into a comfortable pattern. Summers were busy with the cattle and garden. Winters were quieter, focused on trapping and teaching Daniel his letters and numbers. Every few months, they would make the trip to Winslow to visit Robert and stock up on supplies. Daniel loved these trips, fascinated by the town and all the new people. When Daniel was 5, Zelda became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier and the birth was quicker. Their daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Pierce, arrived in the spring, a calm baby who seemed to balance her energetic brother perfectly. Duncan adored her immediately, this tiny girl with Zelda's features and a temperament that was pure peace. He would hold her for hours, just watching her sleep, marveling at the perfection of her miniature fingers and toes. "I never knew I could love something this much," he said one night as he rocked Sarah. "Something?" Zelda teased. "She is your daughter, not a something." "Someone, then." "3 someones, counting you and Daniel." He looked at his wife, his expression serious. "You have given me everything I never knew I needed. A home that feels alive. Children who fill it with joy. A partner who makes every day better just by being in it." "You have given me the same," Zelda said softly. "I was so lost when I found you, or when you found me, I suppose. I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning." As the children grew, the cabin sometimes felt too small. When Daniel was 8 and Sarah was 3, Duncan began building an addition. He worked on it slowly over the course of a year, adding 2 more rooms and a proper porch. Zelda helped when she could, learning basic carpentry alongside their fascinated children. The expanded cabin became the heart of their world. It was where they celebrated birthdays and holidays, where they weathered storms and illnesses, where they built a life that was uniquely theirs. Daniel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved animals and could spend hours watching wildlife. Duncan taught him to track and trap, to read the land and respect nature. Sarah was more social, always talking, asking endless questions about everything. Zelda taught her to cook and garden, to sew and read. When Daniel turned 12, he asked if he could go with Duncan on a cattle drive to sell their stock in Flagstaff. Zelda's first instinct was to refuse. He was still so young, but Duncan convinced her. "He is old enough to learn the family business, and I will keep him safe." They were gone for 3 weeks, and Zelda worried the entire time despite her best efforts not to. When they finally returned, Daniel had grown at least an inch and seemed years more mature. He told Sarah and Zelda elaborate stories about the trail, the other cowboys they had met, the towns they had passed through. Duncan pulled Zelda aside later. "He did well. Worked hard, did not complain. You should be proud of him." "I am. I am proud of both our children. And of us, for raising them well." Life continued its steady rhythm. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Robert died when Daniel was 15, leaving his store to Zelda. After much discussion, they decided to sell it and use the money to expand Duncan's cattle operation. It was a risk, but it paid off. Within a few years, they had one of the most successful small ranches in the area. Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's determination and her father's steady nature. She was courted by several young men from Winslow, but she turned them all down. "I am not settling for someone who sees me as a prize to be won," she told her mother firmly. "You taught me to wait for someone who sees me as a partner." "I did I? You did not have to say it. I watched you and Papa my whole life. That is the kind of love I want." When Sarah was 18, she met a young rancher named James Hartford at a dance in Winslow. He was kind and hardworking, and he looked at Sarah like she hung the moon. Duncan approved of him after a single conversation, and Zelda agreed he was a good match. They married the following spring in a ceremony at the cabin, surrounded by family and friends. Daniel, now 23 and running much of the ranch operation, walked his sister down the aisle. Duncan stood beside Zelda, his arm around her waist, both of them trying not to cry. "How is it possible she is old enough to marry?" Zelda whispered. "I have no idea. She was just learning to walk 5 minutes ago." After Sarah moved to her husband's ranch 10 miles away, the cabin felt quiet. Daniel was often out working the land, and it was just Duncan and Zelda again, like the early days. They found they liked it. "I love our children desperately," Zelda said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "But I will admit it is nice to have you to myself again." Duncan pulled her closer. "I was just thinking the same thing." Over the next few years, they settled into a new chapter of their life. They were grandparents. Now Sarah had 2 daughters, and Daniel had married a schoolteacher from Winslow who gave them twin boys. The cabin was often full of visiting grandchildren, their laughter and chaos filling the rooms with joy. But Duncan and Zelda also treasured their quiet moments together. Morning coffee on the porch, evening rides through their land, nights by the fire, sitting close together the way they had since that first winter. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not gone to check your traps that day?" Zelda asked one night. "Never. Because you would have died, and I cannot bear to imagine a world where I never met you. I think about it sometimes, how close I came to missing all of this. This life, our children, the years we have spent together. It terrifies me. But you did not miss it. You are here. We are here together." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar lines of her palm. "That is all that matters." When Duncan turned 55, he began to talk about slowing down, letting Daniel take over more of the ranch operations. Zelda encouraged it, seeing how the years of hard work had taken their toll on his body. They were both healthy, but they were not young anymore. "I want to spend more time with you," Duncan admitted. "We have worked hard our whole lives. Maybe it is time to enjoy what we have built." They did exactly that. They traveled a bit, visiting Sarah and Daniel and the grandchildren more often. They took up new hobbies. Zelda learned to paint, capturing the landscapes they loved in watercolors. Duncan tried his hand at writing, penning stories about his life that their grandchildren begged to hear. They grew old together, their hair graying, their bodies slowing, but their love never diminishing. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming something richer and more complex than the passion of their early years. On their 30th anniversary, Daniel and Sarah threw them a party at the cabin, inviting everyone they knew. Friends from Winslow, neighbors from miles around, all their children and grandchildren. The cabin and yard were full of people and noise and celebration. But in the middle of it all, Duncan pulled Zelda aside to the quiet spot by the creek where they often walked. 30 years, he said wonderingly. It feels like both forever and no time at all. I know what you mean. Zelda leaned into him, fitting against his side the way she had for 3 decades. I still remember that first winter so clearly, how scared I was, how certain I was going to die. Instead, you lived. We lived. We built something beautiful together. We did. She tilted her face up to his, seeing the lines time had carved around his eyes and mouth, the silver in his hair. He was still the most handsome man she had ever known. I love you, Duncan Pierce. More today than yesterday, and less than I will tomorrow. That is my line. You do not own it. He laughed and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of the comfortable affection of long years together. They lived another 20 years in the cabin, watching their family grow and change. They saw grandchildren married and great-grandchildren born. They celebrated triumphs and mourned losses. They held each other through sickness and health, through hard times and good. Duncan died first, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Zelda beside him. She held his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped, her heart breaking even as she was grateful he had not suffered. She stayed in the cabin for another 2 years, tending the land they had built together, surrounded by memories of their life. Daniel and Sarah wanted her to move to town, to be closer to family, but she refused. This is my home. It is where I belong. She died on a winter night much like the one when Duncan had found her all those years ago. Snow fell softly outside and the fire burned low in the hearth. She had been sitting in Duncan's chair, a quilt around her shoulders, looking at the stars through the window. Sarah found her the next morning, a peaceful expression on her face, her hand resting over her heart. At her funeral, Daniel told the story he had heard 100 times growing up. How his mother had been dying in the snow, and his father had saved her. How the winter made her too weak to travel on, and he had said, "Then stay here and grow strong with me." How that simple offer had led to a love story that spanned 5 decades and built a legacy that would last generations. My parents taught us that true love is not just passion or romance, Daniel said to the gathered mourners. It is partnership. It is choosing each other every day, even when things are hard. It is building something together that is greater than either person alone. They gave us an example to live up to, and I am grateful for every moment we had with them. They buried Zelda beside Duncan on the hill overlooking their cabin, under the cottonwood tree where they had often sat together. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren planted wildflowers on the graves, creating a riot of color that would bloom every spring. The cabin still stands today, maintained by their descendants who refuse to let it fall into ruin. It has become a family gathering place, where Pierce children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren come to remember their roots, to hear stories of Duncan and Zelda, to understand where they came from. And on winter nights, when snow falls soft and quiet over the high desert of Arizona, people swear you can sometimes see 2 figures on the porch, sitting close together, looking out over the land they loved. Whether it is ghosts or just the power of a story well told, no one can say for certain. But everyone agrees that if any love was strong enough to transcend death, it was the love between Duncan Pierce and Zelda Arden, born in a frozen winter and lasting through eternity. Their story began with desperation and survival, with a woman dying in the snow and a man who refused to let her go. It grew into partnership and respect, friendship and passion. It matured into the kind of deep, abiding love that becomes the foundation for everything that follows. The winter made her too weak to travel on, and he said, "Then stay here and grow strong with me." She did. And in staying and growing strong together, they created something that would outlast them both, A family, a legacy, and a love story that would be told for generations to come. Because in the end, that is what love is. Not just the feeling, though that matters. Not just the passion, though that has its place. Love is the choice to stay when it would be easier to go, to grow together when growing apart would be simpler, to build something lasting when the temporary would suffice. Duncan and Zelda understood that. They lived it every day of their lives together. And because they did, their story continues, passed down through the years, a reminder that true love is worth whatever it costs, whatever it takes, whatever must be endured. They found each other in the harshest of winters and created a warmth that never faded. They started with nothing but a cabin and determination and built an empire of love. They faced every challenge together and came through stronger for it. That is the story of Duncan Pierce and Zelda Arden. A cowboy and a woman running from her past. A winter that nearly killed her. And a simple offer that changed everything. Stay here and grow strong with me. She stayed. They grew strong, and they loved each other until death and perhaps beyond. Some stories end. The best ones never do. They just keep going, living on in the hearts and lives of those who come after, inspiring new love stories, new choices to stay and grow strong together. This is one of those stories. And as long as the cabin stands on that Arizona hillside, as long as descendants gather to remember, as long as love exists in the world, it will continue to be told. Because everyone needs to hear, at least once in their lives, that love like this is possible. That finding your person, your home, your place in the world is worth any hardship. That sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best things we will ever know. The winter made her too weak to travel on. He said, "Then stay here and grow strong with me." And she did. And it made all the difference.